Well, hello and good evening, and welcome to episode 6 of the Crane Report. Now, a couple of weeks ago, my guest was David Lim, and we were talking weather wars and weather modification, weather manipulation, geo-engineering, which of course is a completely alternative form of anthropogenic climate change. So we're going to continue that discussion tonight with David. Unfortunately, David was not particularly well last week, in his own words. He was suffering from a bout of man flu, and as of course everyone will be aware, man flu is literally just one small step from death's door. So it's remarkable that David is back with us today, back in I think full health, and we're going to continue that discussion on weather manipulation. Now, I am going to offer a warning. Tonight's programme and the discussion within this programme may well push the bounds of credulity for some. Probably not too many, otherwise you wouldn't be watching this programme. But we are going to be challenging epistemological integrity. You know, epistemology demands absolute integrity. In other words, pushing the bounds of knowledge to the absolute limit, accepting that received wisdom, received information, received knowledge is not necessarily true knowledge, and it certainly isn't experiential. And some things must remain ineffable, completely unknowable. But on the other hand, there's a lot of things that are there visible. They are undeniable, yet the mainstream denies them completely, and thus convincing a significant chunk of the population that it's just not real, that any mention of these subjects is simply a conspiracy. So keep an open mind, and as is always the case, don't take anything that you hear on this programme at face value. We don't want you to do that at all. But do consider checking it out for yourself and pushing the bounds of your own knowledge. So, without further ado, David, are you there with us tonight?
Good evening, Ian. How are you?
I'm good. And thankfully, I didn't see a picture of you when you were suffering from man flu last week, but it does seem that you've made a pretty good recovery.
I stayed in bed all day Sunday, all day Monday as well, tapping away on the computer. My eyeballs felt like they were falling out the front of my head. But yeah, that is man flu for you, isn't it? It
is a nasty affliction. But anyway, great to see that you've recovered. So, David, obviously, when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, the topic of weather wars was extremely pertinent, and we discussed the irrefutable evidence that some of the extremes of the experience, particularly in the Somerset levels and a couple of years ago in Kent, the flooding there, the devastation there, went way beyond the proverbial cock-up theory and was easily traceable to a sequence of events that would appear to have been deliberately contrived to bring about what is ostensibly corporatism, catastrophic corporatism. In other words, you create the misery and it is the corporations who effectively reap the benefits.
That's it. Interestingly, Ian, I was back on the levels on Wednesday, I think it was. I and a couple of members, we took a little film crew down there, and we're shooting, actually. We're trying to put together some information. I'm going to speak to the locals on the levels in about 2 weeks' time and present them with the policy documents from the Environment Agency, talking about the deliberate flooding strategy that they had in place. So some listeners might know that they had 6 policy options, 1 to 6, 6 being the need to actually increase flood risk and to deliberately flood the levels. I think Christopher Brooker put out some information on that. But we went back there and we had some interviews, conducted some interviews, and we were actually showing the locals the reports. And as you were saying, pushing their epistemological views on how they know, what they know, and why they know it.
So this must have come as a complete shock to them. In fact, they must have been asking you where your tinfoil hat was. I mean, to be suggesting that somebody in their government might actually consider deliberately causing this flooding, I mean, must have seemed like something out of a bad B movie.
Well, I was going to say, I'm glad we had a camera there, because some of the expressions were, were beautiful, to be honest. The penny was dropping from many people. You could see, very, very old farming community, lots of locals, and yes, their expressions were a picture, to say the least. Disbelief, and then slowly getting to grips with what they were seeing in black and white. And as you're saying, a lot of the information is there. It's nothing's really covert or obscured to any significant degree anymore. So do you want to go into a little bit about how the dissemination of information and their laws of information have to be put out there?
Well, it's interesting you should raise that issue, because, of course, this is something that has been a common thread through my presentations over the past decade or so. And the point that I've tried to get people to realize is that the belief system of those who wrongly believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom is actually quite perverse. It's very, very different from the belief system that, of course, the majority of people buy into. But one aspect of this is that they absolutely believe that they have to tell us what it is that they are going to do. Which is why I always make the observation that I don't claim any special insights. I simply read the scripts. And it is a question, of course, of knowing where to look and knowing how deep to dig, looking for the players, because funnily enough, it tends to be pretty much the same players, key globalist players who are involved in these think tanks, putting out these scripts in various formats, sometimes just as discussion documents, sometimes as think tank documents, sometimes as open letters to the media, but it is all there. And then, of course, when we don't react, when there's no negative reaction, that's what they take as social license. In other words, our complicity through apathy, our acceptance that their agenda must be the one to follow because we're not objecting to it. Does that pretty much concur with your thinking, David?
Absolutely. I think, as you say, everything's out there. I believe that they adhere to a certain set of rules and boundaries. And one of those rules is that they do have to tell us, and it may just be that one-liner in some 20,000, page policy document, but nevertheless, it is there. Interestingly, somebody explained it to me once, the fact that the principle of natural law allows deception. If you think about the fly trap plant, so with the Venus flytrap, that's it. So the fly comes along, it might brush the teeth, and then slowly the jaws start to close. And you could argue that the fly has been deceived in thinking that there's food there, and eventually gets caught. So it's deception, but it is in nature, and nature has many examples of deception. With eyes on ducks' feathers or fishes, especially in marine life as well. So that is a natural principle. But I think they have taken that in a sociological context and applied it to the people. Well,
sociological or sociopathic? Yes, both, of course. And in fact, much of what we're talking about is very much hidden in plain sight. And although we will talk about documents that perhaps aren't necessarily in the vocabulary of your average Sun reader, but nonetheless they are out there, and of course we encourage people to look at them. And for most people who buy into the anthropogenic climate change, formerly known as anthropogenic global warming, tend to buy in on the basis of the Al Gore presentation, An Inconvenient Truth, which still very many people in this country are unaware that the High Court actually ruled that An Inconvenient Truth should not be shown in schools because there were a number of provable scientific errors contained within that, and it was wrong to present it as a scientific film when in reality, of course, it was simply propaganda. But here's one that you will certainly be familiar with. It's from the Club of Rome document. I believe it's from 1990. And of course, this is actually a bit of a regurgitation of a phrase that was quoted within the report from Iron Mountain, which was 1963, came into the public domain in 1967. But this comment from the Club of Rome says, the common enemy of humanity is man. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy then is humanity itself. And of course, this whole agenda has effectively been used as an incredible divisor. A divisor within humanity. In other words, I mean, first of all, you've got those who have an existential attachment to the belief that man is indeed destroying the planet through his industrial activities, and then those who acknowledge that, yeah, well, you know, there's some pollution issues and we absolutely need to be dealing with them. But is humanity really causing the change in the climate that the globalists are portraying that we do, when we know for a fact that the globalists, and not least led by Mikhail Gorbachev, of course, who was very much partnered with Maurice Strong and in the authoring of Agenda 21. And I believe I think you have the quote, but wasn't it something along the lines of the global warming will serve us well to bring in the New World Order?
That's it, and Gorbachev talks about it being the cornerstone in order to fulfil this agenda.
An interesting Masonic phrase there, of course.
Cornerstone, yes, absolutely. So quite a few people have contacted me over the past few days. I think we've had a significant level of aerosol spraying over the past 72 hours. I think Saturday in particular was bad. I was woken by phone calls and what have you. I jumped onto the internet and had a look at the NASA satellite images, and yes, sure enough, again, pretty much the whole of the west side going up into central UK was sprayed very heavily. Actually, there was a lot of EMF HARP-like cloud conditions by about 8 o'clock in the morning. And yes, you could see the trails being left above the cloud deck. So interestingly, just pulling apart the argument, when people say to me, this is geoengineering, in a way, they are correct in as much as it is being sold to us as geoengineering. But actually, when you look at the definition of geoengineering, which is the deliberate intervention in the Earth's climate system in order to moderate climate change, once you understand that climate change isn't quite the way we are led to believe, then as soon as the definition falls down, then it's not actually geoengineering. So then you have to ask, well, what is it? So yes.
Well, so are we talking? If it's not geoengineering, are we perhaps going a stage further and then talking terraforming?
You could say terraforming. I think, when you look at the soil conditions, the changes of soil, the pH in particular going from acidic to neutral, and so many of you know that neutral isn't great to grow things. When you look at the changing of the water, obviously the particulates are flying around in the air already. On heavy spray days, I sometimes don't even go outside, to be honest. You could say I'm a little bit paranoid, but I do tend to stay inside, and I believe it does help slightly, to be honest. But the issue of terraforming in concert with fracking, Ian, there is definitely something in that. Now, I was just saying to somebody a few minutes ago that a lot of people that contact me often include the fracking element into their environmental concerns, because it is such a horrific program of altering our environment to the point where we cannot sustain our life as we would like to.
Well, of course, it is exactly as per the Club of Rome statement. The threat of global warming, water shortages, famine and the like would fit the bill. And the reality is that, the fracking agenda alone, as we should be talking about again later this evening at 9 o'clock on Fracking Nightmare, but the fracking agenda alone is already demonstrating that not only does it destroy the usable water supply, but in the process it also contaminates soils and, of course, the methane and the radon. But methane being lighter than air and gas, the radon gas being heavier. But the combination of these two are causing an extremely toxic environment. And those people who watched Fracking Nightmare last week would have seen an interview I did with Brian Monk, a farmer from southern Queensland, who basically could not even grow grass on his 5,000-acre farm, and can't keep livestock because the animals will no longer drink the water that is coming from his borehole because it's been contaminated by the migration of gases as a result of the fracking process a few kilometres away from his farm.
I was down on the levels, as I say, a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to the farmers there about what they're going to do next. And indeed, some of the land there is irreparable in terms of some of the contaminants now in the soil. I have a good friend who's involved in agricultural grass seed as well, and they're sending consultants down to have a look and do soil samples to see what can be salvaged from that. So the repercussions from the weather modification is horrendous, to be honest. And I always say, unless you yourself have been flooded, you don't really fully understand what that entails. I think the Online Mail did an article at the weekend showing a lot of the before and after impacts from the flooding, and it's absolutely horrific.
And of course the damp permeates through the walls and the floors, and the smell is with you for not just months, sometimes years. And of course these people are in areas, and of course there are parts of the country that have literally endured 4, 5, and I think Tewkesbury 6 floods in the last 4 years or so.
That's it. Can I also add into the mix that there was a BBC debate, actually, just dedicated to the flooding. They had, I think, James Winslade, one of the farmers down there. They had a representative from the Environment Agency. They had a representative from Somerset Council. And I think they had somebody from RSPB, the birds people. So... Interestingly, when you looked at how the debate was structured and some of the arguments that were raised, when you read between the lines, you could clearly see that there was a potential format at play. But they obviously failed to mention, I wasn't surprised, but they failed to mention the policies from the Environment Agency, talking about the ability to increase flood risk. And they also failed to mention a munitions factory that was due for decommissioning in 2002, I think it was. And that munitions factory was using, I believe, 5,000 million litres of water every year, come rain or shine. And when that munitions factory closed down, the pumps were used to move some of the water from the levels. It was actually using water for the manufacturing process. And apparently, I'm still yet to confirm this, but I'll put it out here anyway, that apparently the Environment Agency were invited to some of the decommissioning meetings, and they failed to even send an engineer to those preliminary hearings. And so the pumps were working beyond its engineering lifetime, I understand, removing water from the levels or to be used. And the Environmental Agency knew that the pumps were going to have to be truly decommissioned, but again, didn't respond to that call.
And of course, the question is it cock up, or was this part of the planning process? And you would think that when one makes the first screw up, then somebody would actually take a stronger look to make sure that there isn't anything coming down the pipe that compounds it. Yet in this situation, it almost seems as though there's been the opportunity taken to say, okay, that's great, we're at first base here, what have we got to do to get it to the next level, and then the next level, and then the next level, until we end up with the catastrophe that we've seen in the last few weeks?
That's right. There were many failures, I understand. Having spoken to some of the locals in detail about the failures of the emergency services, there have been mixed reports. Some people have said that the fire services were invaluable. Others have said that on many instances, directions were miscommunicated. Services were being directed to different parts, or wrong parts even, of the levels, needing to get to people in emergency situations. I believe a helicopter was calling out instructions from the helicopter over the wrong areas. They thought that they were in a different part of the levels, and they were asking people to move a bit prematurely, I understand. So there has been almost like a grading of failings throughout the whole process.
I mean, it's almost like you couldn't make it up. Once upon a time, the emergency services of this country prided themselves on their professionalism. Now, of course, cutback after cutback after cutback. They don't actually retain, with all due respect, the best and the brightest, because the best and the brightest sort of see the writing on the wall and move before they're pushed. And so what you're left with is the people that sort of hang on in there until the last possible minute. And, like I said, unfortunately, they're not necessarily the ones that are quickest off the mark. So, David, let's just go back to the geo-engineering a second, because I was in Bristol on Saturday, and I was just to the east of Bristol, and I happened to cast my eye skyward. And there was this amazing, I use the term loosely, of course, display of trails, but incredibly, they all crossed at exactly the same point. So there was 8 trails, and they all crossed at exactly the same point. Now, the likelihood of that, of course, occurring randomly is slim to none. So, I mean, it was a clear pattern. And, sometimes it's like we were saying earlier, it's like those who are doing this by design just want to give humanity the finger. And they say, like, look, we're going to make it so damn obvious, and yet you still won't see it.
I woke up on, as I say, Saturday morning, a few phone calls, and there were 2 stars almost directly over my house. One was slightly to the west, actually. And I believe some of the meteorological models require the intersection of persistent contrails or chemtrails in order to model the effects at the particular altitudes. Now, I have seen a slight move in the way the trails have been forming. I believe that they've been testing out a few different mixtures, let's say, and even dispersal mechanisms in order to seed the sky. So I think what's happening now is that we're at a stage where I believe a disclosure process is being implemented. I think we touched on it a fortnight ago, in as much as the establishment using different forms of communication, humour being one of them to take the edge off the sting. But I do believe the information is getting out there faster, probably a little bit faster than they anticipated. I think the internet obviously being a big part of that, and just a general raising of awareness that things aren't always as they first seem to be. So recognised for what it is, then there's no point in being covert. You either hurry up the plan because you have to do it overtly.
Well, it's now 4.5 years since the Royal Society published its report in geoengineering, or on geoengineering. And of course, still yet it is a taboo subject. What is it called? Geoengineering the Climate: Science, Governance and Uncertainty. And again, that's a document. It's freely available. It's 98 pages. You can download it. You can peruse it at your leisure. And that's from September 2009. Now,
Ian, can I just say,
go on.
In that report, many people say to me, David, just show me something, show me an official document that suggests that planes are going to be used for this. And that document on page, I think it's page 32, discusses the use of a custom-built fleet of aircraft in order to deliver the particles into the atmosphere. And in connection with that, I also steer people to the regulation of geoengineering, which is from the House of Commons in 2010. And in that document, it actually talks about David Keith, one of the head geoengineers at the moment. He talks about David Keith talking about the Russians who were already testing. So we have an official document from our own government saying that they are aware of certain parts of the country, certain parts of the world where testing is already being carried through. And then you'll get template letters from the Department of Energy and Climate, DEC, Climate Change, talking about them having no knowledge that any geoengineering anywhere is being conducted for any purpose.
Well, it's interesting that, I mean, you point me to page 32. I haven't yet stumbled across the specific comment about the fleet of planes, but here are the paragraphs talking about iron fertilization and nitrogen and phosphorus fertilization in the atmosphere, and that's just on that page. And once again, I mean, obviously it's a document that is there. It's freely available. Very few people are aware of it, and particularly, I mean, not that I necessarily have a lot of time for the Royal Society, because we all know who funds and supports that organisation. But nonetheless, it is representative of the establishment. So there you have it, prima facie evidence that the establishment are actually discussing geoengineering, and this is from nearly 5 years ago. So David, the big question, of course, that everyone says is, yeah, but I know pilots, and there are pilots who say that no, of course this doesn't happen. They're just contrails. But of course there are other pilots who tend not to be too keen to identify themselves, who say that they have also witnessed the phenomena of planes flying either above or below or on a parallel trajectory, who are clearly laying some form of deposit in the skies.
There is a growing sense of anxiety within the aviation industry, especially amongst the pilots. I've had a few pilots contacted me over the past couple of years. I know a couple of pilots myself, and I've confronted both of them with this issue, shown them the evidence, and I can honestly say, hand on heart, knowing these people personally, that they had no prior knowledge at all of this program. So it is compartmentalisation par excellence in terms of what the pilots are being told and what they're being shown. But as I said, there is a growing anxiety and a feeling in the aviation industry. Now, when I was in Germany talking to the doctors out there, I had on good authority from somebody in the aviation industry that one of the dispersal systems to get these particulates into the atmosphere was from what they call pylons, just placed above the back of the jet engines on the commercial aircraft. Now, some of you may have seen these. There are pictures online of this, and you can see three little pipes. Sometimes there's one, sometimes there's two. The ones that I've been looking at predominantly are the three pylons, and they inject matter into the emission flow of the jet itself. So, bearing in mind, the combusted temperature, 1800 degrees centigrade. That's the temperature of the water vapor and other sulfur particulates flying out of the back of there. So we're getting some kind of catalyzation process occurring, I think, when the matter is injected into the emission stream. So I think, again, we're seeing a slight change. The trails that I've seen over the past couple of months have been slightly smaller. They're dissipating slightly quicker. But, again, maybe after half an hour later, we're seeing a much more misty, silky appearance to the atmosphere.
Now, do you think it's a civilian aircraft, a military aircraft, a combination of the two, or none of the above?
It's definitely a combination of the two, Ian. I've on many occasions used plane tracking software. You can go and download certain software. There's a free software which is Flight Radar 24. I think I've mentioned it before, but you can have a look and you can see there's numerous aircraft in the skies at any point in time. If you go on now, even just hover over Europe, you can see many aircraft. And when you can see an aircraft, you can pinpoint what it is generally, and you can say if it's a commercial aircraft. The transponder will be talking to the software, and you can see what airline it is, what altitude the aircraft is at. And on numerous occasions, Ian, I've caught maybe 3 or 4 aircraft in the same vicinity, flying at the same altitude with significantly different...
the data in real time.
That's correct. And so on the other hand, you can see numerous aircraft in the sky that do not show up on Flight Radar 24 or other flight tracking software, and that is typically the military, and with optical binoculars or telescopes, you can actually see the shape of the planes, and lo and behold, they tend to be the KC-135s, KC-10s, a lot of them, and you look at the windows as well. So a lot of the planes will not have windows. That's another giveaway that you can tell that generally it's not military. Either that or the passengers have subscribed to a non-viewing flight. So yes, it's both. But again, interestingly, I'd like to put this out there. I often say to people, how many days do you see military aircraft out en masse with dissipating contrails? I.e., you generally always see the military planes out en masse with chemtrails horizon to horizon. So again, another kind of interesting slant to look at the data and make people think about it.
Well, and of course, I mean, I think the factor here as well is that we've got to encourage people not to look at these issues in isolation. They are part of a broader agenda, and obviously what they're doing is bringing a multi-pronged attack on humanity. And if they can cause division with each of them, because obviously you have those who do believe that there is something untoward with these trails. There are those who don't. There are those who believe in the Al Gore version of anthropogenic climate change and the 97% consensus amongst climate scientists, and those who don't. What is interesting is that it is the fracking agenda that actually seems to be unique in actually the unanimity of bringing people together, because within the anti-fracking community there are people who will literally cover the full spectrum in all the other areas, but they do all agree that fracking is not a particularly good idea for the water supply, for the soil, for the air. And the challenge is actually to keep people focused on those areas where we agree, because the establishment likes nothing better than to keep people at each other's throats by fueling the division.
And I always say, Ian, that people like you and I, or there are hundreds and thousands of researchers in this movement, we are not always going to agree on the details. That's just a given. But what we will generally agree on is the general direction and tone of the policy and where society is going. And that's, as you say, that's the thing that we need to focus on, not the fact that we are disagreeing on, the minutiae of various issues, but the general flow and direction of where we, the populace, are, to where the government is, to where the geopoliticians are taking us. That's the thing that we need to focus and stay united on. And
I think we can sort of pretty much all acknowledge that they are not necessarily operating in our best interests, or in fact, in some cases, in their own. They are very much on the payroll. They are very much dependent upon their source of income by maintaining a degree of cognitive dissonance and not questioning the orthodox version of reality, because they know that if they do, then that income stream is likely to dry up.
That's right. So very often people say to me, if they're spraying, they're not obviously spraying themselves as well, and they'll be spraying their families, etc. And that is true, they are. But I think I had an email through not too long ago. Somebody was alerting me to the fact that in 1995, I think it was, and I'm still to check this, that there was some kind of agreement at higher levels of government saying that certain key members and their families could have access to military hospitals. So again, when you look at the research, some of the papers that talk about the so-called, antidote to what is being put into the atmosphere and going into us, indeed. There are handheld devices, for instance, that you can start to purify blood. You can take blood out, you can put it through certain filters, and then put it back in you again. And this is just, a very, very basic technology that you and I probably will never have access to within our lifetime or where we are in society. But yet, it's there. These technologies and processes are well documented in the medical journals, and I believe, as many believe, that the people in these certain positions have access to these high-grade, high-tech military hospitals. And it may be a case of just having to go there, who knows, maybe just 2 or 3 times a year to have certain chelation therapies or blood purification processes. To be honest, Ian, it's not that difficult.
Well, the other factor is that people can help themselves. Obviously by being very careful, very selective about what they do put into their body. Whether it's the purification of the water, I'm not that I'm promoting them necessarily, but I mean, I've used a Berkey filter for the last few years, and all the water that I drink at home goes through my Berkey filter. Admittedly, when I'm in activist mode on Barton Moss or wherever, my activist diet of fry up in the morning and then cake and biscuits through the rest of the day isn't necessarily the healthiest. But then when I'm at home, then I make the effort to try and ensure that I'm eating a lot more healthy food, and I certainly stay away from the likes of McDonald's, Burger King, and the likes. And I saw an article a few days ago where there was a young woman who was exclaiming the fact that she was extremely overweight because she was on benefits, and the only food that she could actually afford to eat was the junk food. And of course, this food from the junk food outlets is devoid of basic nutrition. Basic minerals and vitamins. It's like eating cardboard, and this is what people are being fed on, and it's not exactly conducive with a healthy lifestyle, with building up the body's natural immunity. So there are things obviously that we can do to help ourselves, despite the fact that we're not necessarily going to be front of the queue when it comes to using some of these alternative technologies.
And talking about the authenticity of some of our foodstuffs nowadays, as you know, there are pretty much just a handful of biotech companies that are in control of our total food supply. A lot of them are
primarily Monsanto and Cargill. Yeah,
they are two of the biggest offenders for sure, Ian. But talking about, I did a talk in Hereford recently at the Steiner Academy there, and I must say the audience was very, very well informed, and we were having a discussion in the Q&A session about, do we have organic food anymore? And I was putting the argument across that actually, personally, I don't believe we do have true organic food anymore, not least because of the sky conditions and the particulates falling onto the soils and changing the soils. But when you put the pieces of the bigger picture together, you understand that this agenda is very old. When I say very old, we're talking over 100 years old. And you would be slightly foolish in a way to think that the access to authentic seeds wouldn't have been considered that far back.
Which is why, of course, Bill Gates has his seed bank in Norway.
That's it, and I understand that was erected at quite a pace back in 2009, I think it was.
Even a little earlier, I think. But,
really?
Yeah, and biodynamic farming, which of course is from Rudolf Steiner, is probably the purest form of organic farming. But what is remarkable is that in the EU, although the percentage is increasing, in the EU, for something to be classified as organic, it must have less than 0.17% contamination, I think it is. Whereas in the US, for something to be classified as organic, it can have 10% contamination. So the reality is that certainly in the US, the likelihood of actually getting hold of anything organic from certainly the normal food stores is slim to none. But David, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Suffice for me to say that, of course, you are on the AV5 speakers list at Daventry on the weekend of May 16 through 19. We have a remarkable array of speakers at this event, and this is certainly a conference with a difference. This is a conference that is designed to stimulate not only curiosity, but to stimulate initiative in the local community. We are here way on the next general election, and there must be few people who really don't see the fact that we need to bring about change, and we need to bring about that change fast. So join me, that's all for tonight, on Humanity versus Insanity, the Crane Report. So join me in 45 minutes on Fracking Nightmare, episode 19, for an update on the court case of the Barton Moss eviction.